Schemelites. I think I've told you that when I was at a meeting of this sort, a thoughtful meeting in Nairobi once, and it was run by students, they called themselves thinkaholics. So you don't mind if I think of you as thinkaholics, it's a compliment. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to welcome Stephen Kinzer back to the University of Scranton. He's no stranger here, but rather a welcome friend, particularly to this year's freshmen. His internationally acclaimed book, A Thousand Hills, Rwanda's Rebirth and the Man Who Dreamed It, was selected as the freshman read this year, a year in which the university highlighted the recent history of that African nation, particularly its genocide and its post-genocide reconstruction. Mr. Kinzer spoke to the members of the class of 2014 upon their arrival and was awarded an honorary degree, Doctor of Humane Letters at that time. And he said you don't have to call him doctor, but you can. A prolific author, an award-winning foreign correspondent who served the New York Times bureau chief as bureau chief in Turkey, Germany, and Nicaragua during his distinguished journalistic career, Mr. Kinzer published in 2010 Reset, Iran, Turkey, and America's Future, a prescient and innovative perspective on the Middle East. Even his fresh insights, however, could not have foretold the events of the past several months. Mr. Kinzer could not have come to us at a better time to help us understand the remarkable discontinuities in that region and their possible consequences. I should tell you that the book, Reset, is here in the back of the room for his signature and your purchase after this meeting, after the talk and discussion. What was to be a talk entitled Facing Disaster in the Middle East? Are there only bad options? Has, due to circumstances beyond our control, become Explosion in the Middle East, Dawn of a New Era. Please help me welcome Mr. Kinzer.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be back in Scranton. I was very humbled by the recognition I received here when I was last here, and even though it's a gray day, really, it's a thrill for me to be here in what I guess is springtime, even though it doesn't look that way out the window. We really have found ourselves in a remarkable situation in the Middle East, and it's one that I don't think anybody could have predicted, although there were some straws in the wind. I've always believed that the fact that the Arab world was the only place in the world where the train of democracy had not stopped was not going to be a permanent condition. We would have never thought some decades ago that you'd see phenomena like democratic South Korea, democratic Brazil, democratic Liberia, democratic Poland. All of that has happened. And it was to be expected that somehow the Arab world and the young people who constitute the main population in the Arab world would want to jump on that train also. Now, at the beginning of January, just as this process was at its very earliest stages, I happened to be in London giving a few talks because they launched the British edition of my book. And unlike in Washington, I found myself the object of invitations to come to the British Foreign Office and talk about the Middle East. So I walked into the Foreign Office where they had assembled the Middle East research team, something I don't even think we have. This is a team that's trying to plan a medium-term strategy. So they're dealing with the period of about 6 months to 5 years. And they have others that are thinking about the longer term and some that are doing the day-to-day work, which is actually an interesting way to divide your foreign ministry. So I went in there and we sat around with this research unit, and these are people whose job is to brainstorm about what's happening in the Middle East. And they told me something interesting. Of course, the new government had just come to power in Britain, but these are career diplomats who had been the leader of the group in there about 10 years. And he said, I said to him, so do you think there is the possibility that Britain will take some dramatic, new, interesting steps in the Middle East in the coming years? And he said, no. I said, why not? And he said, essentially, anything that would be new or dramatic, that would embody a creative approach, a break with the past, an attempt to try something new and different, would automatically mean we would be clashing with Washington. And we can't do that. Because Washington is just not in the mindset to have new ideas and anything that challenges the stereotypes that have guided their foreign policy for the last 50 years. So I said, that was really depressing. And I said to him, so does that mean you think that nothing's going to change in the Middle East? And he said, well, there are really only two ways that things can change in the Middle East. Number one would be if the United States really wants to make a change, if they really want to readjust their approach to the region. That would have a big impact. But if they don't, the only way there's going to be real change in the Middle East is by crisis. If you don't try to manage this process and have a strategy, essentially your strategy is you're just sitting back waiting for an explosion. So that would be our only other opportunity for anything to change in the Middle East. So I said, interesting. If such a crisis were to explode suddenly, where do you think it might be? Long silence around the table, these 6 diplomats staring at each other. I had the feeling they had been spending a lot of time talking about this, and they sort of were just waiting for one person to speak up, and finally one of them just looked up and said, Egypt. And it didn't take more than about a week or two after that Egypt exploded. So that made me think these Brits really are, they've got a good eye. Do they have a little history in the Middle East, maybe? So I think there were some people who understood that there were unsustainable situations in the Middle East. In the long run, this is going to certainly undermine some aspects of American power and American influence in the Middle East. This didn't have to be this way if we had foreseen this and tried to throw our support towards more moderate democratic groups earlier. We might not be facing some of the dangers that we see ahead, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute. Why didn't we do that? I think the answer is pretty easy. We were so comfortable with the old system where we had autocratic regimes that would do more or less whatever we wanted, even if they were not in the interest of their own countries, that it would seem foolish to try to break with that and try to say, well, this can't last, so let's see if we can come up with some more sustainable structures. It's much easier to sit back and say, well, this situation is so comfortable now, let's just hope that it will stay that way. Hope has really been the basis of our foreign policy in that part of the world, along with the backup of a lot of military power and aid. But now we're seeing that has not proven sufficient. Events have really begun to take on a momentum of their own. I do think we're headed for a period of instability in the Middle East now. You might say, how would we notice? But I think it's going to be a different kind of instability within countries rather than just conflicts between countries. Let me just talk a little bit about what I see happening in Egypt, which I think is very important. When you come right down to it, although you won't hear government officials come out and say this, our government, and I think most other outside powers, look at the Middle East as having 3 key countries, and that is Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Those are the potential leaders. I don't count Turkey in because Turkey's not sort of near the Middle East, but I had a friend there who told me that he was meeting a group of Turkish scholars, and they asked him what he was doing there, and he said, I'm studying the Middle East. And they said, so what are you doing in Turkey? So let's put Turkey aside. I want to get back to that later. But in the Middle East itself, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt are the countries that have real potential to exercise regional leadership. At one time, Iraq would have figured into that mix, but Iraq has so many internal problems that it's not a candidate for that kind of leadership. Nonetheless, Egypt, in a sense like Turkey, has a long tradition of leadership and biggest, most powerful, influential country in the Arab world. Now, Egypt is a country where young people are constituting the large majority of the population, but the economy is not able to absorb them. You have this large and growing group of unemployed young people. They're educated but very frustrated, and I think that's a large part of what set this off. There's another piece to what set off the explosion in Egypt, and that's Israel. I think people in Egypt have spent years now, especially now that Al Jazeera exists, watching on TV what is happening in Gaza and what is happening on the West Bank. And this has gotten the young generation very irritated, very agitated. We don't see that here. But there, it's on television every night, and every outrage is played over 100 times. Emotions are very intense. This is not just Egypt. This is a phenomenon that you see throughout the Arab world. And I think other Arabs feel a kinship with the Palestinians and resent what the outside world is doing in its policy to that part of the world. Sometimes I would compare it to maybe an African American living here in Scranton in 1960 and seeing on TV what's happening in Birmingham, Alabama, with the policemen using dogs and fire hoses against demonstrators. And he maybe have never been to the south of the Mason-Dixon line. Nonetheless, he feels a connection, and then he might not want to be so friendly to people who he sees as representing what's happening there. The same phenomenon is going on in the Arab world. And in Egypt, it has a particular edge because young people are not only seeing what they see as injustices on the West Bank and in Gaza, but they're seeing that not only is their own government not protesting, but their own government is actually a partner with Israel in maintaining the blockade of Gaza and has signed a peace treaty with Israel. Back in the time when that peace treaty was signed, I think maybe the Israeli and Egyptian sides had different ideas of what was going to happen. We now, I think, see that for the Israelis, that was the end stop, whereas Sadat believed that this was going to be the beginning of some long process that was going to end in Israel withdrawing back behind its 1967 borders. So I think many people in Egypt feel that they didn't get the bargain that they expected out of that peace agreement. And I believe that resentment over Egypt's partnership with Israel and support for the American-driven peace process was another big factor in promoting the explosion in Egypt. I think that, along with the demographic and social economic factors, triggered it off. And if there was one little incendiary piece that I think also played a role, it was that it became clearer and clearer that the Pharaoh was going to impose his son now as the next leader of Egypt. So therefore, bad as it had been all this time, you now could not even look forward to the biological solution. I actually think that this is a factor in many countries. It's the same thing that was happening in Tunisia. And you might have noticed that within 1 week after the explosion in Egypt, the president of Yemen got up and said, "I've changed my mind about my son now. I'm not going to put him in power anymore." It's also a problem in Libya. This phenomenon of dictators' sons is really something to watch. I do think that it helps set off these explosions. I have watched them, Marko Milosevic in Yugoslavia, Chucky Taylor in Liberia. Some of these young sons get driven to these testosterone-pressed wild excesses of driving crazy cars and beating people up and realizing they have absolutely no check on their behavior. They're growing up in this environment of privilege and having everything handed to them. It's dangerous. And I think it's contributed to this upheaval. It's one of those unseen factors. Maybe dictators really should just have daughters. Daughters have actually had a somewhat better record. If you think of like Indira Gandhi or Pinky Bhutto, women have had a somewhat better record of following their fathers than men have. The other solution might have been one that was used in the Ottoman Empire. They called it the silken cord. The Sultan would have several sons, and before, while they were still in adolescence, he would choose the one that he wanted to succeed him, and the others would be murdered. But they couldn't do it with a knife because you are not allowed to spill royal blood, so they would strangle these kids with a silken cord. I can think of some sons of dictators whose end in that way might have actually contributed to stability in their country. When I first came to Turkey and I spoke with a couple of Ottoman historians about how barbaric this custom was, one of them kind of smiled and said, think of how many millions of people were killed in wars in Europe over succession. Which is more brutal, to do it the European way, where each son has an army and they fight for years and kill thousands? Or we have the silken cord here in the Topkapi Palace. So that really makes you think a little bit about what brutality is and how do you wind up killing more people. This is also a question I think that we can ask ourselves when we look at what's happening in Libya. In Libya, we have a fascinating intervention going on now in which the United States is trying to take the lead, but trying not to take the lead, and wants to get something done, but says we're not trying to get this done, and we don't know whether we're actually supposed to be overthrowing Gaddafi, or are we just there for humanitarian reasons. My read on this is that it certainly is a politically and economically driven intervention, although there's certainly a humanitarian overlay to it. One of the patterns of American intervention is that for whatever motives our leaders take us into war, they always say that the motive is to save innocent people who are being brutalized by a horrible tyrant. And the reason they say this is that it works with us, because Americans are very compassionate people. We hate the idea that people are being killed, and we really want to help. And so I think that allows us sometimes to embrace interventions that are carried out for other reasons. No big outside power ever makes policy in the Middle East without thinking about the oil and gas factor. Americans and the British are eager to maintain a supply of energy from Libya. Russia would refuse to veto the agreement. I think they have the opposite reason. They're a great producer of oil and gas, and if Libya dissolves into chaos, that's one less competitor in the world. And I think this really is a possibility. I can see Libya emerging from this as something like the next Somalia. One thing my friends in Iran always point out to me is that they've learned a very painful historical lesson from what they did by overthrowing the Shah. And they have told me, we all got together, all Iranians, to overthrow the Shah. And we hated each other. These were the communists, the Islamists, the sort of Mossadegh-style democratic liberals. We all got together to overthrow the Shah. And why, despite all our disagreements, could we get together? It's because we all agreed on the one obvious fact, which was that no matter how bad this regime was, we don't know what's coming next, but it's got to be something better. Well, we've learned a painful lesson of history. No matter how bad a regime is, you can always get something worse. I don't want to be put in the position of defending Gaddafi, but I think he might turn out in history to be the last Libyan leader who ever controlled Libyan territory. There are 140 tribes in Libya. The idea that they're all going to emerge as part of a new parliament and embrace democratic traditions is beyond belief. They have no such traditions. In Egypt, you have a series of highly corrupted institutions. There's a corrupted ruling party, a corrupted parliament, a corrupted judiciary, but at least you have institutions that you could try to cleanse. There are no such institutions in Libya. There is no political party. There is no parliament. There is no judiciary. So the idea that this can emerge as a stable state in the wake of this American intervention, I think, really is another example of using hope as your main policy. Whenever you intervene in a country, this is one truth I've learned in studying interventions, you're actually, despite the way you try to delude yourself, always intervening on somebody's side. You're not intervening just on behalf of humanity or human rights or some good cause. You're always on one side or another. So now we have taken the side of some group that's called the rebels. Nobody really knows who these people are. We know that many Libyans have gone off to fight against the American presence in Iraq. They are now part of the rebels. Other Libyans have returned from fighting in Chechnya and Kashmir and other places where the global jihad is underway. Anytime countries dissolve into chaos in the Arab world, in particular, Al-Qaeda is the #1 beneficiary. Somalia has become a base for international crime and terrorism. I think it's very possible that by decapitating the regime in Libya, we may be creating that situation there again. The idea that Libya will be stable at this time next year or 5 years from now seems very far-fetched to me. I can hardly imagine a scenario in which that would be true. Now, going around this sort of arc of crisis that's also an arc of wonderful opportunity, I think, both for the residents of that part of the world and the rest of us. Let me talk about another place that I think, although it's tiny in size, actually more strategically important than Libya, and that's Bahrain. So Bahrain is just a tiny island, just a little speck in the Persian Gulf, connected to Saudi Arabia by a causeway. Bahrain is a majority Shiite country that is ruled by a Sunni monarchy. Same situation that you had in Iraq before the overthrow of Saddam. Now, the reason I think that Bahrain is so important is that both the United States and Saudi Arabia, for their own reasons, are very focused on making sure that there's no change of regime in Bahrain. They have different, although related, reasons. The Americans truly see everything in the Middle East through the lens of what they see as a proxy war between the United States and Iran. They really see, and I think there's some truth to this, a great jousting for power now going on between the United States and Iran. Iran has had a fantastic decade. We have given Iran the greatest geostrategic gifts that it's had in the modern age. Iran was completely in a box and couldn't do anything while Saddam Hussein was in power. All of its geopolitical energy was devoted to trying to protect itself against Saddam. Suddenly, thanks to us, Saddam's gone. Then the regime on the other side of them, Afghanistan Taliban regime, which is run by fanatics who want to kill every Shiite, is also gone. Now Iran has really been on the rise. This is the country that's supposed to be our rival and enemy. We have so empowered Iran that its influence is now spreading throughout the Middle East. And the United States is looking at what's happening in Bahrain. They are seeing the Shiite population, which of course has ties indirectly or maybe directly back to Iran, which is the Shiite motherland. We are seeing also reported involvement of Hezbollah, which is a pro-Iran Shiite group in Lebanon, working in Bahrain to stir up the Shiite community there. So America's looking at the Persian Gulf and they're saying, we got our long-standing problem in the Persian Gulf, which is that Iran is on one side. If the situation in Bahrain changes, you're going to have Iran on both sides of the Persian Gulf. And we cannot tolerate that. That's why this little island becomes very strategically important, much more so than Libya. And as for Saudi Arabia, they are in even greater panic. The causeway that connects Bahrain to Saudi Arabia, also by coincidence, it happens to be the area of Saudi Arabia where all the Shiites live. So that causeway has maybe the bacteria of Shiite uprising can spread across that bridge and infect the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, which has the Saudis terrified. To take that one step further, the reason they're terrified, obviously, is they fear instability within the kingdom. I would say that if that happens, we don't see any sign of that yet, but we didn't see any sign of the rest of this yet. If that happens and there really seems to be trouble in Saudi Arabia and the establishment begins to shake there, the ruling family, that's one where I think maybe this could be the only one where the United States would feel we have to intervene directly. We cannot tolerate the fall of our brother regime in Saudi Arabia. I think this might be something that would be a real moment of truth for the United States. The negative side of getting involved in yet another war in a Muslim country, is obvious and I think should be enough to make us run as fast as we can from that option. On the other hand, without the Saudi regime, the United States has no foundation in the Muslim Middle East. It's often said that the tie between the Saudis and the Americans has to do with oil, and that's partly true. Certainly the fact that Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil producer and has always been willing to collaborate with us in oil production is very important. We also have a very strong deal with Saudi Arabia that started some decades ago when it became clear that we were going to be spending billions and billions of dollars to buy oil from Saudi Arabia. This is when we went to our friends, the Al Saud family, and told them, we can't bear the economic dislocation that is involved in sending you $20 or $50 billion every year. The only way that this can work is if you send the money back to us somehow. You got to buy our stuff. Well, what is there to buy in the United States that Saudi Arabia would want that costs $10 or $20 billion a year? Only weaponry. So Saudi Arabia has become a huge buyer of American weaponry. Recently, we have signed with Saudi Arabia the largest arms deal in the history of the world. $60 billion in arms. That's part of our deal so that we get the money back. Now, the way the Saudis have built their relationship with weapons companies in the U.S. Is wonderfully creative. These companies, once they get a contract for some new fighter jet engine or new radar projects for Saudi Arabia, the first thing they do is divide up the contract into parts and assign them to different factories that are located in the districts of powerful members of Congress. The idea is to make sure that the Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee of either house will never vote to do anything to undermine the strength of the Al Saud regime, because the jobs in their own district are coming from the strength of the ties to this regime. It makes it very difficult for us to step back coolly and ask ourselves whether this relationship and these arms sales are really in our interest. We sold billions of dollars to the Shah, and they wound up in the hands of the crazy mullahs. We haven't really thought through what's the long-term implication of such large arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And this relationship also traps us and could drag us into an intervention that could be very dangerous for us. I think Saudi Arabia is the one place where the prospect of the regime collapsing would really bring the United States to a big moment of truth. It won't be just like these raids in Libya. It would have to be something a lot more serious. So it's a bizarre situation we find ourselves in as trying to be the guarantors of the Al Saud regime in Saudi Arabia. That regime has essentially two pillars. One is the United States, and the other is the clergy of Wahhabi Islam, which is given billions of dollars every year, our money ultimately, from the Saudi government, that it uses to sponsor madrasas and mosques all over the Muslim world, where they send their own brand of extreme Wahhabi clerics to teach whole generations of lost boys how to chant the Quran and hate America. That's the regime that's our best friend in that part of the world. So it was always an unsustainable structure to be supported by these two pillars, because the pillars are so much at odds with each other. The United States and the Wahhabi clergy. Those are the pillars of this regime. And I think in the long run, that makes this regime unstable. 9/11 actually was the example of how those two pillars crashed against each other, because of course, most of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and that was not an aberration. They were the logical products of processes that Saudi Arabia has been carrying out with our blessing, essentially. So this shows you how we've been caught in the Middle East in processes that ultimately are bad for us. Finally, if we look around the region, I'm not going to go through the whole alphabet soup list of countries, but obviously we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for Israel? I think it really does change the equation for Israel. We have this illusion in the United States that if foreign countries would overthrow tyrants and have regimes that really represent what the people want, then those regimes would all definitely be pro-American. They would love us. We actually can only imagine that there's two reasons why people wouldn't like America. One is that they're misinformed about us. They just don't know how good we are. They've been told the wrong thing, so their minds have been twisted. Or the other reason they wouldn't like us is they're bad people. And so, there's an analogy with our personality. That's the way we feel. I mean, I'm a really nice guy. And if you don't like me, the only reason could be that you don't really know what a great guy I am, or you're a jerk. The idea that I'm really not so likable, this is not possible. This does not enter into my mind. I can't, because I know what a great guy I am. This is really the attitude of the United States. In the past, we've gotten into this habit because we were so powerful during the Cold War. We could even make countries do things that were against their own interests, if they were in our interests, because the balance of power in the world allowed that. The balance of power in the world is now changing. And I think Israel is going to have to come to grips with this as well. One of the things you're going to find in the Middle East is that if democracies emerge, although they may not be virulently anti-American, I think there are two things you can be pretty sure of in a democracy in an Arab country. That is a regime that represents the people. Number one, there will be more influence for religion in public life. It will not be a strict separation of church and state. You know, the old Baathists and the old Arab nationalists were militant secularists. People like Saddam Hussein, Nasser, they wanted to kill all fundamentalists. Those days are over now. And I think you are going to see a flowering of religious influence. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have Islamist regimes, but you will see more Islamic influence in public life. And the other thing you're going to see is opposition to some fundamental aspects of American foreign policy, particularly American policy toward Israel. You are not going to get any democratic government in the Arab world that is going to support the policy the U.S. has taken toward Israel for the last 50 years, and particularly that is going to support the Gaza and West Bank settlement projects. You are going to see more militant opposition to those projects. Now, how could Israel respond to this? They have essentially two options. One is to say, we have to be more resolute than ever. Now our enemies are stronger, we're just going to have to be stronger and tougher. The other option would be to say, before the ball starts rolling down the hill and gathers more and more snow, maybe this would be the time to make some dramatic concessions that we've been unwilling to make up to now. Maybe they're even thinking, if we had only done this some years ago, we might have gotten an even better deal than we can get now, but at least now we could get a better deal than we might get in 5 or 10 years. I think this debate is still playing out in Israel. I noticed that a new group is emerging just this week, headed by a former Mossad director and a former director of Shin Bet, the security agency, in which they're advocating that second option. But I still think the Israeli political system is very resistant to this. Some important soul searching needs to be done in Israel to figure out how to deal with this new situation. And in a sense, Israel and the United States are in a comparable position in the Middle East because these were the dominant forces before. But the instruments through which they projected their power are weakening or have disappeared. So it means a great difference in the correlation of forces. Now, speaking about both countries, but particularly about the United States, I think it's apt to point out a larger historical lesson, and that is that countries that survive for a very long time, or empires or powers that last for many centuries, tend to be the ones that can adapt as the world changes. This is difficult for the United States because we have existed actually for a very short time, and the arc of our history, in a way, has been a little bit misleading. We got into this mindset where we're always going to be stronger, and we're always going to be more powerful, and we're always going to rule. And for us to adjust, to change in accordance with the changing world, means to accept that we won't be able to be as dominant as we used to be. It's very hard for the ship of state, particularly in the United States, to turn like that. I think I've always been impressed when I travel in the world, including in the Middle East, that despite all of our sins in that part of the world, there's still a tremendous residue of goodwill toward the United States. I think it's based on admiration for the prosperity and democracy that we've been able to build here. They do admire that. Nonetheless, I think it's important, if the United States wants to play to this, wants to make use of this, that we begin to adapt, that we begin to change, that we begin to realize maybe we're not the only country that gets the Middle East. This has always been our approach. Nobody else gets it. Nobody else understands how the Middle East needs to be run. Even the countries in the region don't get it. Only we get it. This is the mindset we've been in for a long time. Now I think we still have an important opportunity to rescue and even strengthen our position in that part of the world, but we have to change our approach. One of the things I'd like to see us do is begin working with other countries in that part of the world in partnerships that are not like the partnerships we're used to having. We've always had partners, but those are partners that had to listen to what we said and did what we told them. In a real partnership, you have to listen, you have to take advice, as well as just giving it. The United States traditionally is not so good at taking advice. We're really good at giving advice. Now, I think would be the time for the United States to start opening up the breadth of its vision in the Middle East. I think Turkey is one country that would be a logical one for us to work with more closely. Turkey is the most advanced democracy in the whole Muslim world. And Turkey, because of a variety of factors, partly because of its history, partly because of the success of its democracy and its economic boom, is in the position now where it's admired by people on all sides. When the Turkish foreign minister goes to some fractured country like Lebanon or Pakistan, every faction wants to talk to him. It was interesting for me to read in the newspaper just the day before yesterday that the Turkish ambassador in Libya is working to broker between the two sides, and he made a comment, "We are the only country that can talk to both sides." And I think that's true. Turkey is in a remarkable position, plus it's a military ally of the United States. And the best thing that we could possibly hope for in countries like Tunisia, Libya, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, would be that they would come out like Turkey. That would be the best we could possibly hope for. So anything that would promote that possibility is something that would be very good for us. It's Mossad. There they are. I guess that means my time's up. So the central challenge for the United States is to try to break out of the habits that we've gotten into over the 50 years of the Cold War. The strategic environment in the Middle East has changed tremendously in the last 20 years. But our policy has not changed. We're still addressing it with a policy that was made for an era that's over. We are not thinking far ahead. You need to think, where would we like to be in 50 years? What would we like the Middle East to look like, and what would we like our role to be? Then you walk back, as the CIA calls it, you walk back the cat, and then you figure out, what do we have to do now to have the kind of Middle East and the kind of relationship with the Middle East that we would like to have in 50 years. We're not thinking like that because that requires us to break out of this policy straitjacket that we're in. Every time I go to Washington, which is as rarely as possible, I'm always impressed with how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable options. You have to accept a whole series of premises before you're even allowed to participate in policy debates. Original thinking is looked at as the bacteria of some new disease that needs to be crushed immediately before it infects the entire body politic. I think that's what my British friends were talking about. There's a very narrow spectrum. You know, it reminds me of that line that Dorothy Parker once used when she was asked to describe the acting style of Katharine Hepburn. She said, She runs the gamut of emotion from A to B. That's our policy in the Middle East. We really are caught in a very narrow spectrum of options. I believe that this can be an opportunity for the United States, but only if we realize that we can't dominate anymore. In addition, I see another great opportunity for the United States that has to do with energy. One of the things we're wringing our hands about now is what's this going to mean for us in terms of energy? You know, we all want democracy in the Middle East, but I don't think people have thought about how much we're willing to pay for it. What are we willing to pay? Are we willing to pay double the gas prices that we're paying now in order to have democracy in the Middle East? Are we willing to accept governments that are more confrontational with Israel? If that's the price, what price are we willing to pay? When it comes to energy, and I hear these fears that if we don't support the regime and if we don't maintain the kind of stability that we've been used to in the Middle East, we're going to wind up with difficulties in obtaining our energy supply. I'm not so sure that's true, but I hope it is. Actually, if it becomes more difficult for us to obtain Middle East oil on terms that we can afford economically, maybe that will finally be the kick we've been needing to try to follow in the direction of Germany and China and other countries that are taking alternative energy seriously. So I see this as a shattering moment. I think this is a very, very big event we're living through. It's at least as important as what happened in Iran in 1979, which had earth-shattering implications that are still reverberating throughout the world. It is going to result, as I said at the beginning, in a period of instability. I think we're sort of at the good part now. When you look at Egypt, for example, I see the deal that the two forces that are already organized, which are the army and the Muslim Brotherhood, both have an interest in making sure that real democracy does not emerge. They would like to divide the power between them. That's why you had this referendum so quickly in Egypt. If you had had this referendum about a constitution in a year, that would have given time for other parties to develop and new forces to emerge in Egyptian politics. But neither the army nor the Muslim Brotherhood wants that. They would like to have elections really quickly, so they're the only power brokers left. And I think that's what's happening. So you are going to see attempts by ruling groups that have been pushed aside to assert their authority indirectly, since they can't assert it directly. You're not going to see these groups just fade away and disappear. There are going to be power struggles in all these countries. Nobody's going to walk away and say, oh, I was in power for a long time. I lost my power. I guess I'm going fishing in Sharm el-Sheikh. It doesn't work that way. And particularly in a country where you have 140 tribes like Libya. We're at the good moment now. I think some of us feel maybe we saved some Libyans from being killed, and we supported democracy emerging and helped push out the pharaoh in Egypt. It feels good for a little while. We better brace ourselves. I think we're in for a roller coaster ride. But it certainly does underline the validity of what was once said to be the most evil Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
Well, it's our turn to ask questions now and comments. I see one way back there.
Yes, I'm wondering, what is your opinion of Germany's position?
Germany's position. Well, first of all, Europe is in a big mess. Europe is facing a huge identity crisis. Europe doesn't know who it is or what it wants to do or what role it wants to play in the world. There used to be this dream that there would be, if not a European defense policy, at least a European foreign policy. That hasn't worked out, as we saw France and Germany in particular taking very different approaches to the Libya intervention. You know, I lived in Germany for a number of years, and I can tell you that Germany is still in many ways gripped by fear of getting into wars, fear of intervening in military conflicts. Some Germans will tell you that their country learned the wrong lesson. That wasn't the right lesson to learn. Nonetheless, there's no strong support in Germany for Germany becoming a big power anymore. Germany's going to become an economic power, but the use of German military power outside of German borders is something that Germans are still very uncomfortable with. And I think that was what lay behind the position that the German government has followed. I see Europe as very divided on the Libya intervention. I do think that France was the principal driver, and it has to do with Sarkozy, a lot of his... I've always believed that the private psychology of individual leaders plays a bigger role in world politics than we like to believe. And this was something that I think Sarkozy really wanted to do for a variety of reasons, and I think it's been very popular in France. But it highlights the difficulty of building coalitions or seeking international support for these kinds of missions because countries are so divided. I really feel that Europe has huge potential as a foreign policy player in the world, and it could be very positive potential. Europe represents certain ideals, particularly if Europe were to embrace Turkey. That would even strengthen Europe's ability to project its influence. But the European unity project is stalled, and I think the Libya episode is one example of that. Yes, sir.
Covered a lot of areas. Initially, I intended to ask you about where you started in your enthrallment with the British process, other than their accents, since they've had such a dismal planning process for the Middle East. I mean, the record there in handling the Palestinian mandate, dividing Iraq, Suez crisis, involving Saudi. They haven't done very well over the years. So even though they have this great sounding planning commission, maybe no matter what conclusion they come to, they won't have a good idea anyway. But I'm going to put that aside because it's moved into Al Jazeera. And I wanted to talk to you about that. And you mentioned how that seems to be a game changer, at least with the people on the ground. We know what people see. We see the insightful things that are on there. The results of Israeli raids. We see the scholars, quote unquote, who get on and talk about the blood libel of the Jews. The scholarship that says that there was never a Jewish temple in Jerusalem, that Arafat put forth the end of the Camp David Accords. And those are the intended consequences of what people see on television. But I wanted to ask you about the unintended consequences that you see in Al Jazeera when the people on the street get a look at what's happening in places like Israel, where ordinary citizens have so much better lives, where the people have dedicated themselves to building a country rather than trying to tear down their neighbor. And whether or not the Arab street is capable of internalizing this lesson and having self-reflection that maybe they're on the wrong track in many of the things that they've done. And I'll use the analogy of what happened in the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union, where they always used to show American movies and call it Western decadence, and what the message the people saw was, give us more of that decadence. So I think you get the gist of my question. Is the street capable now of separating things, or are they not? Are they just going to buy into this incitement, again blaming Israel for so much of their problems, or allowing their rulers to blame Israel for so much of their own internal problems?
Well, there's no doubt that all during these last decades, when authoritarian rule was the reality in the Arab world, peace between Israel and the Palestinians would have destabilized every Arab government because they rely on this. It's a staple of their discourse. Now, I do think that there is a self-examination going on in the Arab world. The Muslims have a very strong consciousness of the fact that there was a time when they were writing great poetry and looking at the stars in astronomical observatories when people in Europe were living in caves. And what happened? So everybody, they got ahead of us. We closed our eyes for a few centuries, and we woke up, we were way behind. I think there's more of a willingness now in the Arab world to look in the mirror than there has been in the past. And I think maybe that's one reason why there's not such a negative feeling toward the United States. But when it comes to Israel, I think I'd say this. First of all, as you know, Al Jazeera was the first TV channel in any Arab country that actually invited Israelis onto TV. You never had an Israeli minister asked for a comment, ever, on an Arab TV station until Al Jazeera came along. So coverage of Israel and giving Israel's side is something very new that Al Jazeera brought to the Arab world. I find your question very intriguing. I do think that Israeli society could have some lessons for Arab countries, and certainly one thing that makes the idea of collaboration between Israel and the Arab countries difficult is that their levels of development are so different. But I'd say this, I see one big problem, and that is that the ordinary Arab, what you call the Arab, people on the Arab street, are not able to get past Gaza and the West Bank. When you say Israel has created a democracy, Israel has created a stable society, Israel has created an open and a free society, their answer is, well, for the Israelis it has. But they still have, as their first reaction to Israel, their images of the occupation. And I think as long as that's there, it's a hurdle beyond which psychologically many Arabs can't vault. It's difficult for them to say, well, I don't like what they're doing in the West Bank, and I don't like what they're doing in Gaza, but actually their society has many very positive aspects. I think that's too much to ask. I think that would be what I'd like to hear from many Arabs, but the intensity of emotion, stirred up in part by Al Jazeera, no doubt, but also reflected by the reality of what's happening in those areas, has made it very difficult for anyone in the Arab world to stand up and say, maybe there are lessons we could learn from Israel.
Yemen, what's driving the unrest there?
Yemen. Yemen is it's a world to itself. I loved the description that President Saleh once used of what it's like to govern Yemen. He said, it's like dancing on the heads of snakes. And I think he probably chose that metaphor very carefully. So, poorest country in the Arab world, heavily tribal, no real central government. Used to be two different countries, then they united, then they had a civil war. One was so-called Marxist. There are a series of powerful religious influences that also divide the tribes, and Yemen is the home to I'd say the most successful Al-Qaeda subsidiary. They call it AQAP, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. To complicate matters, President Saleh is one of those leaders who has done everything we wanted. We always have this problem with these leaders that we may not like what they do at home, but we support them because they're supporting us in our, what we call, war on terror. Therefore, when the people in those countries are angry at their leaders, they also become angry at us because we're the ones that are supporting their leaders. Now I see there seems to be a conclusion in Washington that it's gone too far with Saleh. He can't survive. So I think you are going to see him, his days are numbered. Nonetheless, this is also very dangerous for the big prize, which is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been intervening even before this started in Yemen. And the United States has also been carrying out drone strikes inside Yemen. Actually, one of my favorite comments in those WikiLeaks cables was one from a meeting with Saleh, the president of Yemen, and he's talking with, I believe it's Secretary Gates, about these drone strikes. Officially, the United States is not carrying out any drone strikes in Yemen. So President Saleh says to Gates, you continue carrying out the strikes and we'll continue saying that it's us that's doing it. course, that came out. That did not do anything to increase his credibility in that part of the world. But he actually said something else, which, although it might not be seem so big to us, I think caused even more anger in Yemen that came out of those WikiLeaks cables. There was a discussion between President Saleh and some American diplomat about the importance of stopping the smuggling trade that's very big going across the Persian Gulf. And President Saleh says, well, I don't mind if you want to crack down on it, but I want to make sure I get my Johnny Walker. That didn't play too well in Yemen. So Yemen is also is a place of growing instability, no institutions to build on. And again, it's another place where we never felt the need to try to encourage the development of institutions because we liked the old system. And we never thought maybe we should start planning for a new age. I could easily see Yemen also dissolving into some kind of chaos. You know, the plot to blow up the FedEx airplanes, that actually originated from Yemen, and that was a tip-off from Saleh's security force that alerted us to that. Once he's gone, the next guy won't be sending us tips like that anymore. He'll be the one putting the bombs in the planes. So that's really something we have to watch out for. When I was in Saudi Arabia researching this book, I was very impressed at how popular Osama bin Laden is. If there were ever a popular election in Saudi Arabia and he could run, he'd be a very strong candidate for president. That shows you how far these things have gone because we have tolerated a Saudi Arabia where our great allies are promoting essentially the view of Islam that bin Laden represents. So for me, although unstable Yemen is in itself a terrifying prospect, although not so far from reality what we've had up to now, if they could just all keep chewing their cud, maybe that would be something to keep the threat down. But the real long-term danger, I think, from Yemen, it's Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is really the center of all this. And as I said earlier, the United States got drawn into the Libya intervention in a sort of indirect way. But with Saudi Arabia, we would really face a difficult moment. And I just hope we don't get to that point. And that's why the Yemen thing really worries me. Mm-hmm?
You mentioned the narrow straitjacket of U.S. policy. How much of that would you attribute to the power of AIPAC? And secondly, is there any politician or public official who seems to have the influence, the farsightedness that could be used against that, who would stand up against it?
Well, so the question was about AIPAC and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which is a lobbyist for pro-Israel causes in Washington, and what is its influence in limiting American foreign policy options. Yeah, I do think that the AIPAC lobby is part of the group in Washington that's trying to keep things the way they have been. For example, AIPAC is one of the principal lobbyists against any reconciliation between U.S. and Iran. Just like there are groups in Iran that want to prevent this reconciliation, there are powerful groups in Washington, and they're doing the same thing. Now, first of all, about AIPAC, I have no reason to doubt their assertion that they are the most powerful foreign lobby in Washington. They're hugely effective, and they even go after congressmen in their districts. So they'll go after somebody in Illinois or somebody in Georgia who they feel is not pro-Israel enough. They'll find a candidate against that person, and they win. They win those elections because they can raise money by saying we're going to campaign against an enemy of Israel. I don't think there's any other foreign lobby that can do that in America. On the other hand, AIPAC is operating within the laws of the United States. AIPAC is only doing what the U.S. Congress and through them, the U.S. people are allowing them to do. Other groups have the ability to do that. If we feel like AIPAC is doing more than we want a foreign lobby to do in America, just look in the mirror. That's the problem. I mean, we're the ones that set the rules, and AIPAC is playing by the rules most of the time. They did have one of their former executive directors or employees arrested last year. But I think aside from cases like that where the law is enforced, AIPAC is just doing what our political system allows it to do. It's part of a larger pathology where special interests have just risen to the point now where they buy and sell congressmen and senators. It's not just foreign lobbies. I mean, if every senator seems like they have the influence, they're the ones speaking for the lumber industry or the financial services industry. That's how you get elected to Congress now, is you put together special interests. You know, not so long ago I was watching an interview on a sports TV show, and the guy being interviewed was a NASCAR driver, and he's wearing one of those jackets like those NASCAR drivers have that's got all those patches on it. It says Mobil, Valvoline, Toyota, and I thought, members of Congress should be made to wear jackets like that, just so that we know who paid for you to get there. I don't know of members of Congress. I mean, there have been some who have made proposals even in recent months, but let me just make one other comment that's a little bit broader than that. I feel that foreign policy issues and questions about America's role in the world and whether America should continue to follow this sort of interventionist, exceptionalist idea in the world, whether we should continue to embrace the idea that the world is a dangerous place, it needs to be managed, and we're the ones that are called on to do the managing. This has been our mindset for many years. Whether the debate over whether we should continue to follow those ideas and that path has now transcended the right versus left spectrum. And it used to be that you'd say conservatives are right-wingers, they never saw a war they didn't like, and leftists are always against everything military. I don't think that's true anymore. Trying to follow a foreign policy of moderation, prudence, and humility is not necessarily a leftist or rightist idea. It's actually a very conservative idea. It's the idea that we are not on a mission to run and change the world and make it become like us. This is just a question between whether you want to be a visionary utopian or whether you want to be a calmer realist. I think it's. I actually wrote an article for the Libertarian magazine in Washington. They wanted it in their January issue when all these new Tea Party people were just arriving in Washington. And essentially what I said is, so you Tea Party people, you say you want to be revolutionaries, you want to do everything all different? Why don't you start by looking at America's role in the world and asking yourself, do we need 750 military bases in the world? Do we need 11 carrier groups patrolling the oceans when there's no other country in the world that has more than one? Couldn't a different kind of foreign policy be something that could unite people from different parts of the political spectrum? Now, some people are skeptical about this. One of my colleagues at Boston University is Andrew Bacevich, who's written some interesting books about America's role in the world. And one of his lines is, you can't change just because it's in America's DNA. We just feel like we're supposed to run the world and nobody else really knows how to do it, and we have to do it. Otherwise, everything's going to be chaos. You can't get this out of the minds of Americans. I'm wondering maybe if the evolution of American politics and American economics is finally going to force us to reassess some of these things. But I really do think, if nothing else, that we're entering into a period where we're at least asking questions that we haven't asked for a long time, and I think that's good. I don't know if we're going to get to the right answers. It may be too late by the time we do, but anything that shakes up our assumptions, I think, is positive.
Do you think that the difficulty in the relationship between Israel and the Arab world is in part how the respective cultures perceive women, in that here is Israel, on the one hand, as a matter of conviction and necessity, as equality in terms of public life and military, and on the other hand, in the Arab world, total subjugation.
So the question was, does the difference in the way women are treated in Israel and women are treated in the Arab world form part of the reason for the hostility? Actually, I'm seeing more and more Israeli women are covering themselves as you're getting more immigration from places like Morocco and North Africa. And Israel is also becoming a much more religious society. I don't think that Ben-Gurion or Golda Meir envisioned Israel developing this way. I can remember Golda Meir, when being asked on American TV if it was true that she was an atheist, said that not only was she, but most members of her cabinet were also. And in fact, in her memoirs, there's a moment where she's sitting with Jimmy Carter, and they're talking about religion. And Golda Meir says to him, "You don't really believe any of that stuff, do you?" And Jimmy Carter said, "Yes, I do." I don't think you'd have a discussion like that with some principal Israeli leaders now. Again, I want to go back to an answer I gave earlier. I think that the Arab impression of Israel is so dominated, justly or unjustly, that's another question, by the settlement project in the West Bank and by the blockade of Gaza, that they can't even get past that to be thinking anything about what's going on inside Israel itself. Unless the emotion that is raised by those two aspects of Israeli policy can be reduced, I don't see how Arabs are going to look clearly at Israeli society and ask themselves if there's any lessons they can draw from that. It's just not a situation where there are half a dozen or 20 things about Israel that people in the Arab world are interested in. They're only interested in one thing. After we get past that one thing, then we can talk about 100 other things. But I don't think that there is much interest in or awareness of Israeli society within Israel. The only thing that Arabs define Israel by is the situation of the Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza. And that may or may not be fair, but until that situation is changed, I don't think you're going to get a change in Arab opinion. And I would add that in the long run, I don't think Israel will be able to guarantee its long-term security and survival forever by military means alone. If you look at the geography of the region and the changing demographics, you have changing demographics inside Israel, changing demographics in the Arab world, even changing demographics in the U.S., where the old generation that remembers the Holocaust and grew up supporting Israel at all costs is fading away, and a new generation is growing up in the American Jewish community of people who are just going to judge Israel like any other country, and if they don't like the way it behaves, they're not going to support it. All these changes mean that the only long-term security or guarantee for Israel is a calm neighborhood. Only stability in the Middle East is going to guarantee Israel's survival. If there's constant hostility from hundreds of millions of Arabs, that's very dangerous for Israel in the long run, and it also promotes anti-Semitism in the world. People who have never seen a Jewish person in their life that are sitting in Malaysia are becoming anti-Semitic. The only thing they know is they're watching what's happening on the West Bank. In the long run, this is very dangerous for Israel. So Israel has to find ways that will try to calm the neighborhood and calm its relations with its neighbors without surrendering vital interests. And talk about vital interests, let me just say this as a footnote. Gaddafi's biggest mistake, and I'm sure he's sitting in his room banging his head against the wall, was that he gave up the nuclear program. If he had only hung on to his nuclear program and developed a nuclear bomb, we wouldn't be bombing him right now. And he knows that. And if I'm sitting in North Korea or I'm sitting in Israel, I can tell you what I'm thinking. No matter what they promise you, never give up your nuclear option. Because as soon as they disarm you, they're going to come and get you. Look what happened to Comrade Gaddafi. And if I'm in Iran, I'm thinking, whatever it takes, we've got to get the nuclear bomb. Because otherwise, it's going to happen to us what just happened in Libya. There's one unintended lesson we're sending out around the world. Okay, I think that does it. On that happy note, thank you so much.
I want to thank Stephen so much. The first thing I want to say is thank you, Stephen. You have informed us. You haven't comforted us, but you've informed our panic. The second thing I want to say, and the last thing, is to please join Stephen over at the book table, and he will talk to you more. He'll sign his book, and you can buy his book. Thank you very much. And don't forget, next week, 1 week from now, we're going to be here right in this room to hear Ambassador Rabinovich.